Hi everyone, my name is Jörgen Andersson. This is me. I work for Pensionsmyndigheten, a Swedish pensions agency in English. Here in the middle you have my email address if you want to get in touch with me afterwards as well. In 1999, when I graduated from university, we were still in the pre-agile era of waterfall systems or waterfall projects. Organizations tried to sort of manage risk by putting up those quality gates where you had to write detailed documents describing what was to be done and how, and they were reviewed and then signed off. And we wrote long documents with software architecture and proposed design decisions and even pseudocode sometimes, long before anyone was allowed to do any implementation programming at all. And that is what we call today big design up front. But we were wrong, of course. As soon as we started to implement, we learned things and we had to do changes, and no one ever read those documents again and definitely not updated them. So in 2001, the Agile Manifesto was signed, and the word of working software over comprehensive documentation started to spread, and we entered the Agile beginnings, where the Agile cowboy was in charge. You know, we're agile, we don't do documentation, we don't need documentation, the truth is in the source. And of course, the source code is really valuable, especially if it's well written, and you can find a lot of information there, except when you can't. Like when some neighboring team come and ask you, how does this work? And why do you do it like this? And depending on who the team is, they might not be able or not willing to read the source code to find out for themselves. Or you go back in time and start to think just for yourself, why do we really do it this way? What was the reasons we had to do it? That is certainly not found in the code. And then you have new teammates coming to your team, and they need some high-level overview in order to be able to dig into the details of the code base. And in all those situations, typically the most senior person on the team finds themselves standing in front of a whiteboard, drawing and telling the same story over and over and over again. I've done that many times. But I think we learned. We learned to have a more balanced view on documentation. Nowadays, everyone is agile, whatever that means in general terms, but when it comes to documentation, for me it means just enough. To focus on the essential parts, those that you can't find in the code. We've learned that we don't do those long descriptive documentations long before we implement things. We don't have to do that anymore. But we also have learned that some high-level documentation is quite handy to have around for those situations we just talked about. So for me, my preference on documentation for a system is to have some high-level design diagrams telling me about the context of the system, what does it look around us, the internals of the system, like the services or the modules or whatever you like to call them, your data sources and how they are connected, and perhaps a view on how you are deployed in production in terms of instances and hardware and that sort of thing. And then some high-level description of why is the system here, what is it supposed to do, links to more details, perhaps descriptions of requirements, ideally in the form of executable tests, some information on how to monitor the system in production, could be a good thing. But the most part of that documentation is there to answer the why and how questions, and that is all the architectural decisions that you made along the way. Architecture decision records, or ADRs, is not a new thing. They were coined and defined in this blog post by Mikael Nygård in November 2011. So actually, ADRs just turned teenagers. In this text, he argues that useful documentation, valuable documentation, has to be updated. and it has to be read. And long documents never get updated, and they hardly ever read. So they are not valuable. Instead, he proposes for us to create a collection of records of architectural significant decisions. Each record is a short text file in a specified format. We'll come back to that on the next slide. He also says that the records should have numbers, and they should never be removed. They should stay forever because we want to have that history. And he also says that we should keep those records very close to the system, ideally in the same repository as the code, or very close to it, because things that are close to the code, things that are close to where developers live, tend to be updated and tend to be read. It's simple but very powerful idea. So what about the format then? Quite easy. Start with the title, descriptive title. It's a good start. And it has a number, remember that. And then we go into the context, and this is where it gets really interesting, because this is where we talk about why do we have to make this decision? What are the forces that pushes us to choose the solution we have chosen, or that sort of sets up the limits for us? Then we have the decision itself. Very short descriptions, a few sentences, because it tends to be more than one decision that sort of comes out of this context you have described. And a good pattern is to start, we will do something this way. Then every decision has a consequence, or many, both positives and negatives. So that's what goes into the last section of that text document. And here we describe what happens when we do it like this, and what are the possible downsides. But this is also a good place to shortly mention what other solutions did we think of that we didn't choose, and why didn't we choose those? Because that is the type of information you want when you go back in time and try to understand, or when you come new to a project. Then status, and that is administration. That is because those records should stay forever, and so they need to have a life cycle. They start out as being proposed. That's when someone thinks that we should make a decision, and it should probably be this decision, and we need a starting point for a discussion. So we create an ADR, we set it in proposed state, and we start the discussion. And when everyone in the team and people around us that needs to have a say in this decision says, okay, this sounds good, it's accepted, and that's when we start to live by it. That's when it's active. But then times go on, and things happens, and we realize that we should probably do things in another way, so we set up a new decision, and that's fine. We need to change. But then we don't want to change or remove this decision. We want to just say superseded by and link to the new one. And there we have our history. I like ADRs. I use them a lot. In my current project, I'm lucky enough to have a greenfield project. So I started to use ADRs even before we starting actual development, just by putting down a series of them describing my view on what the software architecture should be for this system. And it turned out to be a really good basis for discussion, both internally in our team, but also in the rest of the organization. And it was very well received that they had this material to talk about, and we could, as we progressed in the discussion, we changed things, and we started to say like, okay, so we agree on this one, then that went accepted, and the other ones we had some more talk. But you're not always that lucky that you can start from the beginning. So, you know, the best time to plant a tree was like 20 years ago. The next best time is today. So start as soon as possible. And even if you're in the middle of a project, if you're working with a system that's been there for a long time, start to think about documenting the next decision you make, because you tend to make architectural decisions all the time. And perhaps you need to often explain certain things, and then you can sort of retrofit some of the decisions for those most important parts of your system as well. Because the value comes over time when you can share and use this simple documentation. I use markdown files because it's easy to read the raw file, and it gives us the possibility of a nicer representation as well. I keep them in source control, because especially when it's in the proposed state, it's nice to track the changes, and also I get a date when I do the change to accept it. As I say, we use the statuses. We keep them short and to the point, trying to keep them like only concerning one thing, and instead have many of them linked together with references. That's why we keep dry. So it builds a fabric of those decisions, and of course supersede them when they are not used anymore. So I promised also in the abstract to end the presentation with a short tooltip, and this is mine. I use Structurizer for publishing my ADRs. It's an open source tool by Simon Brown. I haven't seen him today, but he will be here tomorrow because he has a presentation tomorrow. Not specific on this this subject, but anyway. It can visualize the ADRs in Markdown format, and here to the right you see an example of my ADR number 1. The statuses and the headlines are kept in English for the system to understand what it's actually saying, but the text is in Swedish because that's the context we currently work in. I also think it's really nice to be able to publish the decisions outside of version control, because it makes them more available. Everyone can come in and read them on this server, and it's also easy to just pick a link and send it to whoever has a question about why or how we're doing things. Structurizer is a much bigger tool than just on publishing ADRs. It was from the beginning created for visualizing Simon's C4 model diagrams. So that is the bulk of the system. But it also can visualize ADRs, and it can visualize other high-level documentation in C4. So actually this is a tool that fits all the criteria I have for good documentation for a system. So that's my tip to you to look for. Thank you very much for listening, and I think there might be a few minutes for questions as well. And you've seen this code in many presentations now. That's for Jfokus rating, so please use that one as well. Thank you.